We started off the beginning of the year, because at the beginning of the year, we're still in January, and at the beginning of the year, we realized there's some changes we probably need to make and want to make. So we talked about maybe we need to reset the way we look at ourselves during this year, because if we reset the way we look at ourselves, it kind of resets the way that we live, and so we need to move away from our past and get beyond the past and press in a hopeful future. Last week, we had an amazing service. I'm telling you, God just steps in and does incredible things. If you missed the service last week, you missed the service last week, and God just moved in, and we need to reset the way we look at God sometimes, because God wants to empower us to go reach the world around us. So we need to reset the way we look at God. And then the other thing, like where we are today, is sometimes resetting the way we look at time. Time is fascinating to me. My great uncle was a watchmaker, lived out north of Williston here, about 20 miles, and I just loved, as a little kid, being in his watchmaker's shop and just being surrounded by the ticking of hundreds of watches and clocks all around me all the time. I just got this thing about clocks. I love clocks, and I love the sound of clocks. Time is amazing. If you think about time, there's probably people that are here that are far more scientific than I am, but they say it's one of 4 dimensions that we live in. We live in a 3-dimensional world that we can see things with height and width and depth, but then the 4th dimension is this thing called time. You understand that time is just something that God created to help us understand Him a little better. It gives context to life, and it's so valuable. I don't know if you thought about this very much, but they're not making any more time. Have you thought about that? God invented time, He created time, and He brought you into this world. You were born into this world, and you get X number of days to live in, and no more. God's not inventing any more time for you. There's just only so much time that we have. It is so valuable. Think of all the different ways we use to keep track of time with watches and with clocks, and you can hear the second hand on some clocks just tick, 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 tick. Tell me when you want me to stop. Tick, tick, and it just goes by. And it's just amazing how valuable it is. When you're little, time seems to go by agonizingly slow. You're in the 3rd grade. I don't know if we've got any educators in the house today, but I'm just telling you, when you're a 3rd grader and you look back at the clock on the back wall at Wilkinson Elementary School, and it's 12 minutes after 9, and it feels like you've been there all day, and the teacher starts to talk, and she talks and 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 talks, and you pull out your book and you do a paper, and she talks and talks and talks and talks and talks, and she talks some more, and you pull out another paper and you read the book some more, and then you turn around and look at the clock, and now it's 9:15. Like 3 minutes went by, and that's just the way it is. Christmas isn't months away, it's years away. It'll never get here. And then when you get older, like you're my age, it seems like you get up in the morning and you go to bed at night. You get up in the morning and you just go through the workday, boom, time is gone, you come home, you have some supper, and the next thing you know, it's bedtime. Do you know why that is? Because you just slept through your favorite show and half the news. That's why, see? And so time seems to go by so fast as you get older. There's even a website that you can go to. I don't recommend it. It's called deathclock.com. Please don't do that on your phone while I'm up here speaking to you this morning. And you enter in some information about how you live, where you live, how you eat, and all that kind of stuff. And it predicts how many days you have left to live. Doesn't that sound encouraging, huh? It's just amazing. So sometimes we say things, well, I just lost track of time. What time is it? But probably the bigger question that we all need to answer from time to time is this: what am I doing with my time? Because at some point, you probably reevaluate time. When you're young, you don't think much about time. In fact, we have a young lady right up here in the front today. She turned 21 today. How many wish you could be 21 again, but know what you know right now? Wouldn't that be awesome? And then at some point in your 40s, probably in your 40s, you don't think about how old you are. People celebrate the birthdays, and maybe they bring out the black on your 40th birthday or whatever. And so you don't think about how old you are. And I think part of the reason is you're in denial about how old you are. But you start thinking about how much time you got left. Isn't that depressing? How many are glad you came for the first service this morning? The second service, we just talk about completely different stuff. And so somewhere in your life, you start looking at time a little bit differently. You reprioritize things. At least you think about reprioritizing things in your life. Because for all of us, Time becomes a commodity for us that we value, and we're running out of it. And so at some point in our time, we need to pull back and look at time as a commodity and realize how we need to be spending our time. So this morning, I've got a couple of things up here I want to use to illustrate time for us a little bit. So we're going to use this is our life. This is our life right here, and we're going to use all these rocks up here to represent how we use time in our life. And how we sometimes waste time, how we use our time. And so just think about the course of your week and the course of your day. So all of these little blue rocks, this represents the time that you spend doing stuff. So we just think about your day. Tomorrow morning's Monday, this afternoon you get home after church, and you know how you spend your time, right? Everybody spends their time. Facebook, Instagram, binge watch, Netflix, Instagram, Facebook, eating, hanging out with friends. Exercise, Facebook, time eating some more, watching TV, sleeping, hanging out with friends, Facebook, more hanging out with friends, exercise, more Facebook, and pretty soon the day's over. And then at some point in time we go, you know, I was at church today. I know I should spend some time with God, because the pastor says so, and I claim to be a Christian, so I should have some God time in my life, you know. And if you're married, it's kind of important that you spend time with your spouse. So you got your marriage time. You got kids. You should probably spend some time with the kids. You got a job or other things that got to get done around the house. And then you realize, I just don't seem to have enough time in the day for God or my spouse or my kids. I'm just exhausted at the end of the day. You all been there. And we have our priorities sometimes set so wrong in our life. We try to fit the God rock in there, but here's the thing. What if we reprioritized our life? And this is where we get later on in life. What if we did this? What if we reprioritized how we use time? What if we said, in fact, you know what? Maybe the first thing in my day should be God. In fact, I know one guy that said, no breakfast, no Bible, no breakfast. No Bible, no breakfast. Not quite that extreme, but there's got to be time with God every day. I come in here in the morning, spend time with God, sit with my wife and pray. We spend time early in the morning, because if I don't get it done in the beginning of the day, there just isn't enough time in the rest of the day. So what if we put the God rock first? You know, Robin and I just thought about this preparing the message this morning. I thought, honey, you know what's amazing? You and I always seem to get to church on Sunday. It's just incredible. I don't know how it happens, but we just get here. And the only time that we're gone from church is when we're out of town. Weird, huh? Anyway, we just always seem to have time for church. And even when we weren't in the ministry, we still got here. So what if we put the rock in here first that's God and reprioritize the time? What if we said, you know what, honey, I think our marriage is kind of important. I think we should spend some quality time together and make time to be together. What if we realize that we need to give more effort and energy to the important things in our life? Maybe it's your job. What if your children were a rock in your life and you said, you know what, there's a ton of things I could do with my life, but I realized that I got to spend time with my kids. And you put the right things in first. And then you took all the other things that you have going on in your life and you said, you know what, there's Facebook, there's binge watching Netflix, there's hanging out with friends, there's going to the coffee shop, there's things I want to do. I've got hobbies. I've got travel. There's a lot of fun that I want to have in my life, and there's things that I want to do. And isn't it true that if we put the right things, I really hope this works, first, we just seem to have time for everything else. You just need to, exercise. There we go. Okay. But isn't it true if we put the important things in first, there seems to be time for everything else? Because time is a commodity. It's valuable, and it's precious, and we're all running out of it. And for a few moments this morning, we're going to look at a psalm, Psalm number 90. It's a psalm that a guy named Moses writes. that helps us get a context of who we are in relationship to God and his timeline. Moses, we know him. If you know anything about Moses, you know that Moses was this amazing deliverer for the nation of Israel. But he didn't start that whole journey until he was 80 years old. From 40 to 80, from age 40 to 80, Moses is a shepherd in the wilderness. I'm just imagining, if you're a shepherd in the wilderness, that Tuesday looks a lot like last Saturday. That Friday looks a whole lot like Sunday did. Just walking behind sheep, trying to avoid and I'm just imagining that every day kind of looks the same. And if you're just wandering around the desert for 40 years, you have a lot of time to think. You've got a lot of time to think about time. And that's exactly what Moses does. And so the psalm that we're about to read gives us context for time, because context is everything. Time has to have a context. Our time has to have a context in comparison to God's time in order to give your life meaning and purpose. We've got to view our life in the context of God's plan for our life, in the context of his clock. Because if we do, our life will have more value. If we don't, life seems really kind of pointless. When you're young, and I'm not trying to be mean or anything, but when you're young, when you're in your 20s, teens, 20s, maybe even into your 30s, you just think that life is really all about you. It's about hanging out with friends. It's about your career. It's about your college. It's about your job. It's about your friends. It's about your college. It's about your career. It's about your job. It's about the person you want to marry. It's about hooking up with a date. It's all about you. You just think that life is all about you. That's just the way it gets. As you get older, you start to think, if you don't have a context, at least for God's timeline, as you get older, you might possibly think, what's the point of life? See, when you're young, you think you're the point. When you get older, you wonder, what's the point if you don't understand that God has a plan and a purpose for your life? If you get to be an old person and you say, what's the point? It's kind of like this. You know what? Here comes your conclusion. If you don't have a point for living and existing in this life, you think, I'm born. I'm just born. I go to school. I go to college. I get a job. I get married, have kids, retire, and then I die. And if you believe in reincarnation, you get to do it all over again. Except as a cow or something, But anyway, but Moses in Psalm 90, he helps us understand the value of time, how God sees you in the context of his time. And when we do, when we really appreciate that, it changes the way we live our life. It ought to, at least. Look what he says in verse number 1, Psalm number 90. He says this, Lord, through all generations, you have been our home. The fact that he says all generations right away sets the timeline. That God has always been here, and he's always going to be here as long as there are people around. This is about God's timeline. This is about God's clock. All generations is the frame of reference. It's not your timeline, it's God's timeline. And God has a plan. And he's got a good plan for you, and he's got a plan for me. He says in verse number 2, he says, before the mountains were born, before you gave birth to the earth and the world from the beginning to end, you are God. In other words, God, you've been around a long, long time. Understanding that time, again, is a dimension, it's a creation that God made to help us understand him and how he values us. And then I love verse number 3. Verse number 3, look what he says, verse number 3. You turn people back to dust, saying, you turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. I mean, it's kind of cool, isn't it? It's just kind of like this powerful statement. I think Moses realized at some point on the backside of the desert, shepherding all these sheep out there, that this body that we live in dies. And like any cremation person can tell you, that our bodies are reduced to 4 or 5 pounds of dirt at the end of life. And he realized that God has a different timeline than we have in our life. Verse number 4, he says, you know what, for you, God, for you, 1,000 years are as passing days, or 1,000 years are as a passing day, as brief as a few night hours. One of the New Testament writers makes reference to this. Peter, he says, look, for God, 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. And people misinterpret that and go, well, in God's clock, a day, one of our days goes, that's 1,000 years in the whole. No. What he's saying here is that time is non-existent for God. It's inconsequential. God is not limited to the dimension of time as we understand it. God has always been, God will always be. That we frame everything up on a calendar. It's on your phone. It's on a calendar. It's planned somewhere along the line. God doesn't have to worry about that because God's always been. He doesn't get anxious because things are taking too long. He doesn't get anxious because we're doing things too quickly. Time is non-existent for God. He doesn't exist in the clock like you and I do. He says in verse number 5, you sweep people away like dreams that disappear. They're like grass that spring up in the morning. Verse 6, in the morning it blooms and flourishes, but by evening it's just dry and withered. In other words, that when God looks at people, God has been around so long that people just come and people just go and hardly a person notices. It's amazing on Memorial Day weekend when you go to the cemetery. You can go to one of the cemeteries right here in Williston. And you go to the cemetery, in the new part of the cemetery, people that have been buried in the recent past, the graves are replete with all kinds of decor, chimes and lights and flowers. And as you move across the cemetery to the older parts, not a flower. Not a flower. Why? Because those lives were fleeting. Those lives flourished in a moment like the grass in the morning, and at the end of the day, it's just withered and it's gone. Nobody remembers them anymore. You might be famous, you might be popular, you might have a lot of friends, you've got a mailing list, you might be on social media, and you've got hundreds of friends, but you understand the day is coming for you and for me when we lay in the grave, and nobody knows that name. Nobody knows what we look like. You can put a picture on the gravestone. Nobody can identify it because it was 2, 3, 4 generations before us. We have no association with them. So Moses says, I realize that life is like that. How many are encouraged? Glad you came already this morning. Isn't this good? And then he says in verse number 10 of Psalm 90, he says this, look, 70 years are given to us. Some even live to 80. I thought about this a little bit. If you're over 80, does that mean we're living on borrowed time? I don't know. But anyway, he says, but even the best years are filled with pain and trouble, but they soon disappear, and we fly away. Moses, as he writes this, maybe he was nearing 80 years old when he writes this. He's saying, you know what? I recognize in time that God gives us a lifespan, and in that lifespan there are mountaintops, and there's valleys. But it's all just really, really short. I mean, life just goes by like that. And then he says in verse number 11, who can comprehend the power of your anger? Your wrath is as awesome as the fear you deserve. That seems a little bit different than the verses that we just read, but what Moses seems to be saying is we need to step back and get a grasp for the size of God, the immensity of God, that God can do anything at his will and for his purposes. It's effortless for him. And I think he says all of that to set us up for what he's about to say next. He's going to say, look, in light of your power and your timeline, in light of your power and your timeline, and this is a prayer that he prays, remember. Look how he prays in verse number 12. And I like the way it says it in the New American Standard. He says, in light of that whole thing, God then teach us to number our days. Teach us to number our days that we can present to you a heart of wisdom. Think about this for just a moment. Put your life in perspective to God's timeline. How long are you going to be here? When you're young, you just think that life is all about you. You don't think much about the future. And that's not being derogatory. It's just the reality of where we live. And then you get older. And as you get older, you start to have a whole different perspective on time. Because as you turn older, you realize how quickly the years have gone by. When you're in your 20s, you think you've got eternity before you. And then it's somewhere in your 40s, you go, holy cow, I'm half dead. You know? It just goes by so fast. And if you put your life in the context of God's time, if you put your life in the context of God's time, suddenly it has significance. Let me just say something to you for a moment. If you're young today, if you're here with a parent, let me just say you're here with a parent and you're like a kid, an adolescent, teens, 20s. Take just a moment right now. Look at your parent. Just look at your parent. Just go ahead. Look at your parent. That's you. Okay? That's you. That's going to happen to you, right? That's going to happen to you. Except, let's just be honest, you'll have a better fashion sense than your parents do, all right? Okay, so anyway. If you don't put your life in the context of God's plan for your life, life will be hopeless. But God brought you into this world with a passion and a plan. He put you here with a purpose in mind. He's given us so many years to make an impact and make a difference in our world. He's got a purpose for you being here. If you don't have a good grasp on that, you'll think that life is all about yourself. And when you think that life is only about you, you will not have a good reputation. You know those people. They're egotistical, they're narcissistic, or they're a dictator of some country. But when we put things in right context with God's plan for our life, we start to number our days. And all of us have numbered our days. All of us have numbered our days until a wedding date. All of us have numbered our days until somebody comes home for the holidays. We've all numbered our days until Christmas gets here. We've all numbered our days until a contract was expired. We've all numbered our days until we get to a destination. We've all numbered our days until Christmas gets here. We've all numbered our days until we take a test. All of us have numbered our days. So in this verse, Moses is saying, Lord, teach us to number our days. And when you read that, you go, number our days until what? Well, until we die. That's really what he's saying. He says, we have to learn to number our days until we die. I know that the logical question is, well, when is that? Well, if you go to deathclock.com, in other words, what Moses is saying in this prayer, we put verse number 12 back up there again. What Moses is saying in this prayer is this. Lord, help me have an accurate assessment of time so that I use it wisely to make better relational decisions, so that I can make better financial decisions, so that I can make better moral decisions, so that I can make better use of the time that you gave me, realizing how short my life is, so that I can present to you a heart of wisdom, so that when we get to the end of this life, we don't go, I guess I put the wrong rocks in first. Teach me to make better decisions about money and relationships and maybe your plan, your goals, your agendas for my life. And for some of us here, maybe we just need to kind of reset how we look at time because we don't know how much we have. Here's the tendency for all of us in this room, at least myself, is that we can look at time as being a limitless commodity that we all have. We don't think about the end of this life one day. And I know this, that none of us in this room want to get to the end of our life and go, I wish I had, or I wish I would have. I wish I'd been. I wish I hadn't. So Moses says, teach us to number our days aright. Let me ask you this. We're almost done. What would your life look like? What would your schedule look like? What would you feel like if you put the right rocks in first? What if the God rock went in first? How do you think you'd feel worse about yourself? You know, Pastor, I started that devotional thing that you talked about. I started reading the Bible and just spending some time waiting on God early in the morning. And I got to tell you, my life is a wreck ever since. I'm telling you, my life has gone downhill and my marriage is worse. I feel worse about myself. Or do you think you'd feel better about yourself? How do you think your family would look? How do you think your family would feel? What would be the environment of your house if your spouse came first? If you loved and adored your wife and your children, and you put aside the addiction, you put aside the hobby, you put aside the job that you don't have to give as much time to as you do, do you think your home would be a happier place or a more tense place? What if your finances got put in the right order? What if the God rock also involved your finances and you started to financially prioritize God's kingdom instead of your kingdom? Do you think it would get better or worse for you? What if you started to prioritize taking care of this body that you got? What if you started taking time to feed it and nourish it and exercise it well? Do you think you'd feel better about yourself or worse about yourself? What if we started to learn to number our days aright? To just start with God. Take care of ourselves. Here's the interesting thing. God first. You can't love yourself properly until you love God properly. You can't love your spouse, your children, your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews. You can't learn to love any of those properly until you learn to love yourself properly. So let's put God first. Let's put the God rock in. Let's take care of ourselves. Let's take care of our spouse and our children and our job. And how would resetting the right things in your life feel for you today? I'm telling you, God has a plan for you. He's got a plan. There's a reason that you exist. There's a reason you have a name. There's a reason there's a birth certificate on record with your name on it. God brought you into the world. And he said, I have a plan for you. Don't miss that plan by putting the wrong things first. Put the right things first. And realize the plan that God has for you. God says, I have a plan to bless you, a plan to prosper you and not harm you. I've got a plan for good for you. I brought you into this world. I hung a clock on your wall so that you could get a grasp of how fleeting time is. And you could use it wisely and fill it with more good rather than sorrow.